Welcome to Clued in Mystery. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Brooke, and we both love mystery.
Hi, Brooke.
Hi, Sarah. How are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. How about you?
I'm really excited because I can't wait to talk about villains with you.
Yes. Criminals and villains have long held a special appeal for audiences, and in this brief overview, I'm going to mention a few that have proven popular for years, starting with Robin Hood. Historical references to the thief date back to the 13th century, and literary references to the 14th and 15th century poems and ballads. And there are many television and film adaptations of the character, so he remains someone who is certainly popular with audiences today. Fans of Sherlock Holmes will know Professor James Moriarty as the famous detective's foil, though he actually only appears in two stories, The Final Problem and The Valley of Fear, and he is mentioned in 5 others. I really loved how Anthony Horowitz handled him in his book, Moriarty. Fans of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson will see parallels with A.J. Raffles and his sidekick, Harold Bunny Manders. Raffles is a cricketer by day and amateur cracksman or burglar by night, and the stories that I read were largely about how he committed his thefts and evaded capture, with Bunny recording the exploits. The first story featuring Raffles was published in 1898 and written by E.W. Hornung. The character was first inspired by Sherlock Holmes, and Hornung had a bit of an advantage in that respect since he was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's brother-in-law. And so no doubt the two of them had plenty of opportunity to compare notes. Raffles is not the only popular gentleman thief. In 1905, Maurice Leblanc introduced his character Arsène Lupin to audiences, and he features in a total of 17 novels and 39 novellas. The character serves as inspiration for a modern Netflix series, Lupin. And interestingly, in several stories, Lupin actually meets a character who is not so loosely based on Sherlock Holmes. Initially, he did call the character Sherlock Holmes until Doyle complained, and then renamed him Herlock Sholmes. and and they meet in several stories. And Holmes, Lupin, and Raffles share a lot of qualities, including sharp wit and an affinity for disguise. As a reader or a viewer, it can create conflicting feelings if we're rooting for the bad guy. But when it's done well, it can be really satisfying. Brooke, what do you think about this?
I think that was a fantastic introduction, first of all, Sarah, and so good. And yeah, absolutely. I was reminded of a quote by Alfred Hitchcock, who, of course, is the master of suspense. And he says, the more successful the villain, the more successful the picture. And I think that that's exactly right. And that does bring up what you said, that sometimes they are the most compelling figure in the story. We find ourselves rooting for them. One of the stories that you mentioned in the intro reminded me of a more modern take on that, which is Catch Me If You Can. I believe that it's also a book, but I've seen the film with Leonardo DiCaprio. And you're very much rooting for the quote unquote villain to evade capture. I mean, he's doing these amazing, smart, creative feats, and we watch to see if he's going to be able to evade capture from the bumbling detective, which doesn't hurt. I mean, that's just always a fun addition to a story too.
What you're talking about the bumbling detective, it sort of throws the hero detective trope on its ear, right? So if we're going to be rooting for the criminal or the villain, I think the detective almost needs to be someone who's, not as clever as our hero, who's actually the villain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that brings up a really good thing when we put quotes around hero. And I've always been a little confused in my head. Okay, we have the villain and then we have the anti-hero. I poked around in that to clarify for myself what the difference is between those two characters in a story. And so villains are the characters who are motivated by evil or darkness. Their ultimate motivations are not sympathetic. It's pretty hard to get behind these guys. And they are wanting the protagonist's demise or the opposite of what the protagonist wants. But an anti-hero's motivations, we can get behind them. They're sympathetic to a reader or a viewer, and often because they're working for the greater good. And it's what you referenced, Sarah. It's the Robin Hood scenario. He does some bad things, but it's to help others. So some examples of villains are, so the truly dark guys. We've got Sid from Toy Story. He doesn't have very many redeeming qualities. Darth Vader, Hannibal Lecter, the Grinch. So these guys are just kind of rotten to be rotten. And then anti-heroes, we've got Dexter, Walter White from Breaking Bad, Tom Ripley. Tom Ripley is a bit of a question mark for me, so maybe we can talk about him. But Walter White is a great example of an anti-hero because he does all sorts of really horrible things. You name it on the list of crimes, and he and Jesse probably carry them out. However, from the first episode, we learn that he believes he's dying, and he's got all these intellectual skills, and so he's going to start dealing drugs to hopefully care for his family after he passes away. So you can get behind that as a viewer. You can understand on some level the dire need that he found himself in. So I think that that's the kind of character that is the most fun to root for in a film or in a book, or probably more on the spectrum of the anti-hero.
That's a really great distinction, Brooke. And I think I'm with you. I don't think I would put Tom Ripley in the anti-hero. I think he was much more of a villain than that. But if I think about anti-heroes, it's maybe Tony Soprano.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Maybe Danny Ocean and, Ocean's 11, because, you're watching that film and you're really hoping that they get away with robbing this casino. And obviously audiences have enjoyed that franchise because I think there's even another one that was recently announced that they're looking at doing. So I think if as a reader or a viewer you're cheering for someone who in the real world would be considered a criminal, then that's a really effective anti-hero. But then there's some like Tom Ripley it makes you really uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's how you know that that's a villain.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree. I'm not sure about Tom Ripley on that list. To me, he feels like straight up villain. But another way to make the distinction is to ask yourself, if this character won, if they got what they wanted at the end of this story, what would the outcome be? And many times, if the anti-hero wins, it's still the greater good, even if they had to do some pretty bad things to get there. So yeah, exactly, Sarah.
Well, and that's the thing with Dexter, right? Like he has a moral code in terms of who his victims are. But if you look at it, he's a serial killer.
Yeah, that was such an interesting and groundbreaking series, right? To have us all rooting for the serial killer. And I think when a villain, and we'll just say villain because overall we know what we mean, the bad guy in the story, when a villain is done well, it really can cause us to ask some of those bigger questions. It really can show us that good and evil and right and wrong aren't black and white. It's shades of gray, because can you say what Dexter was doing was right or wrong? I mean, these are these deep dinner time conversations you get into with people, and you could argue it forever because there isn't a right answer to that. And so I think it's really cool what a villainous character can bring out in a story.
Absolutely. I think about a lot of the examples, perhaps with the exception of Dexter, are nonviolent, right? I think there's this kind of universal appeal of someone who is getting away with either pulling one over on the authorities or on the wealthy, like Robin Hood, or the Ocean's Gang, right? Where there are they really harming someone by stealing that money?
Yeah, exactly. And those are definitely my favorite. Like, I love a good heist story. I think they're so much fun. And yeah, there's a feeling that like there really isn't a victim here because it's like the big rich casino, or it's the wealthy billionaire who can do without that $100,000, or something that really no one's getting hurt, but you get to see
Mm-hmm.
the tricky behind the scenes um, attempt for them to steal this. And I think that another reason that we really like this is sort of the same thing we talked about in the true crime episode, where you get a little hit of adrenaline by watching these people commit crimes, and yet we're rooting for them and we're still at that safe distance. It's fiction. It's just for fun. The other thing that I thought about is the fact that many times in a story, a villain is actually the underdog. Even though they may appear at the beginning to
Mm-hmm.
be the strongest and most equipped in the story, we know that in the end, they're probably going to lose. The hero is going to prevail. And so it's always fun to root for an underdog.
I agree. And just picking up on one of the comments that you made earlier about kind of getting that view into how they commit the crime. So it's, a little bit different than in detective fiction, where the detective is trying to figure out kind of what happened. In a lot of these, particularly the ones that we see on screen, you get to see, either the planning that goes into the caper, or there's that kind of scene at the end where they show how the painting actually hadn't been stolen until they came in later and they grabbed it, right? Like, I'm thinking there was a series by BBC called Hustle, and it was, a group of con artists / thieves who would plan these thefts where they would, go into a museum and take an expensive painting, and you would see the different characters that they would take on, the different personas, so that they could do that. And you see the same thing in the Netflix version of Lupin, and as well as you get that in the stories about Raffles or Lupin, the original stories. You kind of get that insight into, how did they very cleverly come up with ways to commit those crimes.
Yeah, that's right. It's the inverse almost of the detection novel, but to me, it's the same type of satisfaction that you get in rather than unraveling the crime, setting up the crime. Yeah, they're great. It's great fun.
When I was thinking about some of this, Brooke, I was thinking about unreliable narrators and how they're often the bad guys, right? And, we as an audience don't often realize that they're unreliable until that big reveal that happens later in the book, like we talked about in the episode that we did about unreliable narrators. And some of them are, I think, these antiheroes that we've been talking about, and that kind of adrenaline rush that you were talking about that you get as a reader or viewer when you realize, oh, they've been bad all along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're one of their victims because you've bought into their lies. Yeah,
Totally. Yeah.
I listed both Moriarty and Gone Girl on my list of like kind of some of my favorite villain based reads, and noted the same thing you did, that for a long time into the story, you don't realize that they're the villain. And that is exactly like you said, because of the unreliable narrator component that's laid over. So yeah, when you look at it the way that Flynn and Horowitz constructed these stories, it's extremely clever, as we would expect from both of those authors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I read one recently called Counterfeit by Chen, where I still think about this book because I think about, like, okay, whose story was the true story? It was done really, really well, and it's about counterfeit goods, and it was quite good.
I'm writing it down right now because that's a litmus test for me. If you are continuing to think about a book days, weeks, probably even months later, that's one I want to have on my TBR, Sarah.
I think one of the things that happens with the antihero is the way that they're portrayed as being misunderstood, right? And there's an element of that in some children's books that I've encountered, where the character that we traditionally think of as being a bad guy is portrayed as just being misunderstood. I mean, there's a whole series called The Bad Guys, where this is the part of the original premise of the books, is that, these characters that are traditionally considered bad are actually out to do good things. And I think that's really interesting, the kind of playing with that, even at an early reader level.
Yeah, yeah. And that takes us back to that anti-hero, right? But it also, I think, is a very important part of creating any villain, because they need a backstory. And many times when we find out what the rest of the story is for them, there is a little part of us that sympathizes and realizes that, oh, well, if people really understood, then they would get this person better. I mean, I think even though we put the Grinch in the villain category, straight up villain, there is some good in the Grinch, and we also know that there's a twist at the end and he becomes good. I think that that's also a trend that we see in many of these. The Catch Me If You Can story ends that way. Abigail becomes an FBI, I believe, officer. So, there are redeeming qualities. Maybe they're just misunderstood.
Yeah. And there's, I think maybe that's one of the things that as audiences we like, is that redemption that happens at the end, right? And, thinking about a backstory and, understanding that maybe this character only had bad choices available to them, or, when we think about our What Would You Do episodes, where this is the only choice that the character could make, right, that led them to being a villain or being an anti-hero.
So, Sarah, that gives me an idea. Maybe one of our upcoming What Would You Do episodes will be one of these stories that are villain based, and we can put ourselves in the shoes of the villain character rather than the hero.
Yeah, I love that idea, Brooke. Well, Brooke, I think this has been a really great conversation.
Yes, this has been so much fun. And we've talked about some of our favorite types of stories today, as usual. But before we say goodbye, I would like to share 2 great reviews that we recently received on Apple Podcasts. The first is from Stella Bixby, and Stella gives the show 5 stars. She says, "Great podcast, easy to listen to voices, great content, and good resources." The second one is from Ross Girl, who also gives the show 5 stars and says, "Don't let the chill vibe of Clued In Mystery fool you. These ladies know their stuff. I've learned so much. I've added to my want to read list and discovered TV shows that are fantastic. If you're a mystery lover, this is a must listen podcast." We want to thank both of you for taking the time to rate and review the podcast. It truly means the world to us to hear listener feedback. Reviews definitely help new people find our show, so if you would be willing to leave a review on the platform you listen from, we would be so thankful. Until next time, thank you for listening to Clued in Mystery. I'm Brooke.
And I'm Sarah, and we both love mystery. Clued In Mystery is produced by Brooke Peterson and Sarah M. Stephen. Music is by Shane Ivers at silvermansound.com. Visit us online at cluedinmystery.com or social media at Clued In Mystery. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or telling your friends.